Okay, this is a 9 for a review of 9 different algebra questions. The next unit we're going to start in the new year will be our Algebra Chapter 8. So these are your basic questions that you would have learned in grade 7 and 8. The first question is a grade 7 question, two-step algebra question. It says 2x's plus 1 more equals 3. So when you have equations like this, you must identify your constant and you must also identify your coefficient. And the reason why you have to know what those are is because what you learned in grade 7 and what you learned in grade 8 is that the easiest thing to get rid of when you're isolating the variable is the constant first. We're going to learn that in grade 9 we don't necessarily have to do it that way, but in grade 7 and 8 that's what we learned. And we learned that that's an opposite operation, leaving us with 2x is equal to 2. And since that says 2x is equal to and 2 as a coefficient is a multiplier, the opposite to that is division. So dividing both sides by 2 will give us an answer of x equals 1. And that's the solution for the question. So if I went back and I actually took that x and I erased it, instead of saying 2 times x, I said 2 times 1, I would see that both of those sides would be equal because 2 times 1 plus 1 is 3. So the value of x must be 2. In your second question, it says half of x minus 1 equals 3. And I think what we learned in grade 7 was that we represent half of x like this, minus 1 equals 3. And since half of x minus 1 equals 3, the first thing we learned to do was to get rid of the constant, which means we will add 1 to both sides. And in doing so, we get half of x is equal to 4. And once we get down to half of x is equal to 4, since if I double half of x, and if I thought about it doubling it, so again, if this was half of x and I doubled it, these two things together would make a full x, and that's the idea behind doubling half of x. So if I double half of x, I get x, and if I double one side, I have to double the other, leaving me the solution of x equals 8. If I go back and check my solution by substituting, and, oh, where am I going here? And I put 8 here instead of x. 8 divided by 2 is 4, and 4 minus 1 is 3, so therefore x equals 8. And over here, x equals 1. I made a mistake before, x equals 1. Your next question, your constant is now 2, and your coefficient is 4, and some people get confused by that because the constant's never usually the first term of your expression, but because it is, it's still going to be subtracting 2 to get rid of it, leaving you with 4x equals negative 10. Divide both sides by 4, and x will equal negative 2.5, which confuses some people because they're not accustomed to seeing values of x being not whole numbers, right? So decimals can be the values of x. In the next question, we have two groups of x minus 3 equals negative 10. And when we learned how to envision this, we said there's two groups of x minus 3 equals negative 10. Right? Now, obviously, there are two ways to solve it. Remember this. The first way you could do it is to expand using distributive property. So instead of saying two groups of x minus 3, two groups of x minus 3 would mean you have two x's, and you have two negative 3's, and two negative 3's is negative 6. So when you expand using distributive property, you would create this equation instead, which is 2x minus 6 equals 10. You then get rid of your constant to get 2x equals negative 4, and you divide both sides by 2 to get your solution of x equals negative 2. That's one way to solve it. But the other way to solve it is instead of having two groups of x minus 3, if I divide both sides by 2, instead of having two groups of x minus 3, when I divide it by 2, I would have one group of x minus 3 equals negative 5. I would then add 3 to both sides, and x would equal negative 2. If I substitute my answer of negative 2 into my equation, instead of x, I put negative 2 here, then negative 2 take away 3 is negative 5, and therefore 2 times negative 5 is negative 10. So the value of x is negative 2. Our next equation, -5 is our constant. And right here, if I ask you what is the coefficient of x, how much of x do we have? The coefficient's not 4, it's a quarter of x. If I asked you how much of x do I have, you would tell me you have a quarter of x. If I was to draw it, and this was x, I would draw it something like this, a quarter of x. So because of that, the first thing I'm going to get rid of is my constant by adding 5 to both sides. I would then have a quarter of x is equal to -2. And in order to have x, if all I have is a quarter of x, if I multiply it by 4, that will give me a full x. So whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other. So multiply this by 4. I get x equals -8. Next equation, not only is my constant the first term of my expression, but it's also on the right-hand side, which is different than most equations. So I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides to get rid of it. Over here, I'll have -2. Now, the important part here, Faith, is that when you look at what remains on the right-hand side, it is not 2x. It is -2x. Okay, so what remains on the left is -2, and what remains on the right is -2x. Then divide both sides by -2, and x will equal a +1. X will equal a +1. Same type of question with the next one. Our constant is 5, so I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides to get rid of it. -7 is equal to. When I'm left with this, what we learned was if you were left with this expression, -1/3 of x, you can rewrite it this way, or you can write it this way. All three of those are the same thing. And when given the choice, the way you should choose is this way. And that's because in my next step of my isolating the variable, I'm going to multiply both sides by -3 to get x equals a +21. Okay, so when you're given that, remember to do it that way. Next question is distributive property like we did in question 4. The only difference is we have, instead of having a positive number over here, we have a -6. So we can expand. -6 times 2x is -12x, and -6 times 1 is +6. So that's what I get here. I get -12x, I'm going to subtract 6 from both sides, is equal to -18. And divide both sides by your coefficient, and x will equal a +1.5, because 18 divided by 12 is 1.5. And your last question is a tricky one because it's actually a two-step equation. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply both sides by x. And multiplying by x and dividing by x are opposite operations. I'm left with 2 over here equals -8 times x is simply -8x. Divide both sides by -8, and x will equal -1 or -0.25 or -1/4, and that is your solution.